Thank you so much again. And just to get a sense of who do we have here in the room, I would like to ask you if you are from the SJLP region, raise your hand. All right. If you are familiar with the SJLP region, raise your hand. Yeah. Okay. If you have heard or used the term wasta before, raise your hand. Wasta? Okay. Good. You know, once in a conference, a former head of government joked with me, and he said even he needed a wasta to get things done. So our culture is really full of beautiful customs. When we talk, I'm sorry. Oh yes, of course. Maybe. We'll see now. We'll see. You know, our culture is so full of beautiful customs when we try to present it and showcase it. You know, we talk about our generosity, we talk about our loyalty, we talk about our hospitality. I mean, all of us fight over the bill, we know that, right? But sometimes we avoid talking about other normalized dysfunctional things that were kind of becoming embedded in our culture, like wasta. So this conference is about change. The concept and the vision is to weave a better future for our region. So I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this cultural panel where we're gonna try to talk about culture, history of culture, preservation of culture, maybe change of culture, I don't know, we will see. But please join me in welcoming this eclectic panel, starting with Associate Professor of Islamic History at the University of Oxford and a fellow Rhodes Scholar from class of 2007, Christian Zanner. The founder of RUAC, Center for Architectural Conservation, and award-winning writer, Suad Al-Amiri. The famous artist and architect, Muhammad Hafiz. World-class musician and composer, Kinan Azmi, who amazed us a couple of days ago. And TV presenter and the rising social media star, Bishir Najjar. So thank you so much for joining us, first of all. And I would like to start with Christian. Once upon a time, you asked me questions on the Rhodes Selection Committee. Now the tables have turned.
Revenge.
So Christian, would you please start us off by telling us as a historian, did our culture change or moved over history? Or how do we have now, why do we have now this idealized narrative of our culture from your own perspective as a historian?
Well, first of all, let me just say it's wonderful to be here. As Amr has just said, I have the pleasure of serving on the selection committee for the SJLP region. And so we're extremely proud of our students. And I think that this entire weekend is a testament to their great intelligence, their vision, their organizational skills, and so much else. So very quickly, a thanks to you. I want to say also that on a panel about the culture of the SJLP region, I am conspicuous in that I'm not actually from the SJLP region, so I speak with some trepidation. I speak as someone who is an admirer of the region, a lover of the region, and a student of the region. So I hope what I have to say is interesting and useful. But you've asked about change. Yes. Every region changes, and I think that one of the great joys of studying the region of Bilad al-Sham is to study a region that is in a constant state of flux. So we live in an age in which politics nearly everywhere around the world, and in particular in the region that interests us most, would tell us a story of fixed categories, of people who have been there forever, of conflicts that are primordial and go back into the distant sands of time. To study history is to see something different, is to see that things have been in flux and that the problems of today were not necessarily the problems of yesterday. And likewise, the future is not yet written. And so I take solace in that. Maybe I can just say something personal about my experience first visiting this region. It was my good fortune to start going to Syria and then the rest of the countries of the region when I was a Rhodes Scholar, and it was happenstance that led me there. And what really led me to fall in love with the region once I was on the ground, living in Damascus at the time, was the chance to explore the monuments of this region. And many of you will know these monuments, perhaps as I do, as matters of academic interest. Many of you will probably have grown up around these monuments and have deep, deep emotional attachments to them. And what I discovered about these monuments, and here I'm thinking of things like the Jam al-Umawi, the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, and plenty of others, was so characteristic about the material heritage of this region were its layers, its complex layers. We see it with that mosque, but we see it with countless other places throughout these 4 countries, that you see multiple cultures, religions, peoples, and civilizations cohabiting the same site. It's the common story nearly everywhere that you go. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of visiting it, the Umayyad Mosque is probably Syria's most famous monument. It's most important. It's printed on the money. It's the first thing that you'll see portrayed in a tour guide. It's one of the oldest standing monuments of Islam, dating to the beginning of the 8th century, so less than 100 years after the Arab conquest of Syria. And it stands on the site of an older Byzantine church. And that Byzantine church, in turn, stood on the site of an older Roman temple, and back in time. It is a site that is sacred to Sunni Muslims. It is also a site that is sacred to Shia Muslims. Many of you will know that there's streams of Shi'i pilgrims from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iraq, and from Iran who visit that site. So I think that a place like that encapsulates something that is distinctive and extremely special about the culture of this region. It is a culture that is plural. It is a culture that is constantly in flux. It is a culture that is incredibly rich. And I could probably say something similar about a range of other things. But again, to just go back to the point I made a minute ago. We live in an era in which so many, I think, of the political problems in the region stem from narratives that would have us believe that, that groups, that religions, that ethnicities and languages exist in monolithic kind of categories. And as we heard in the past presentation from Professor Shati, this is a region that is literally constantly in flux. And to study history and to encounter it through works of art and architecture is to challenge that story. So when we look ahead to a more positive future and we think about what resources can the past, the Bilad al-Sham, provide us for hope about the future, I think it's that message of the plural, of the diverse, that at least gives me hope, again, as a student of a region. So maybe I'll leave it there and hear from others.
Absolutely. Then what drives me now to Suad, I mean, you founded Riwaq in 1991 to preserve architectural heritage and landscapes. Why it is important to preserve heritage. And we're going to see some slides now to show the artwork of the artists because they wanted to show you who they are through their art as well. So we'll see some of the preservations you've made through the artworks of also Mohammed and Kinan. We'll see some photos. And Bishar, we'll see your photos also up there on the slide, so please help me with the tech. Yes. Yeah, so why it is important to preserve and what are we preserving?
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm always introduced as an architect or as a writer, but very few know that I define myself as a Hakawati, actually. So if the others have a chance to speak, they're lucky today. What I want to say, maybe I am the only one from Bilad al-Sham in this panel. You are all from Syria, somehow, on my left and right. I define myself as Bint al-Sham, Bilad al-Sham. The reason I say that is I grew up in Jordan. I was born in Damascus. My mother is Syrian. I studied at the American University of Beirut, the most beautiful years of my life. And in '81, I went to live in Palestine. So I really think, I thought a lot about the name of this panel. As a dyslexic person, we always have, I wish you called it Bilad al-Sham. Full stop, without Jordan, Syria, blah, blah, blah. But not blah, blah for Palestine and Lebanon. But it would have been nice just to call it Bilad al-Sham. Another reason for that, I must admit, I am dyslexic. And those of you who are dyslexic, we have difficulty with abbreviations. So at the first morning when I was sitting there, and you were all saying SJLP, I thought that you were talking about LGBT, and I was thinking, wow, how progressive this group is. So my wishful thinking is really to call it Bilad al-Sham for dyslexic people like myself. Okay, what I want to share with you today, actually, is a little bit of my life. I have the 10-year itch. Normally, people have the 7-year itch, and they divorce the husband or the wife or the partner. I have a 10-year itch in which I divorce whatever I did in the past, and I move on to do something else. So I will share with you from 1981, 1991, 2002, and 2011. What happened in these years personally? 1981, I was living in Amman, and I decided to cross the bridge with, I had no one in Palestine. Believe me, my mother thought I was crazy, and I am. So I took a permit in a language that I don't understand and crossed the bridge. I took a leave without pay for 6 months from the University of Jordan. And the leave without pay for 6 months is 40 years now. They haven't called me yet, but I'm living in Palestine. And that was when I started my interest in cultural heritage in Palestine. I did my research and my PhD on Palestinian village architecture. Now, every time the Israelis put us under curfew, I come up with an idea. In 1991, they put us under curfew for 40 days, the Israelis, during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And that's when I came up with the idea of Riwaq, which is basically the conservation of historic buildings that I will tell you more about. And then, in another curfew, they put us under in 2002 in Ramallah. Sharon invaded Ramallah. And that's where I became a writer and wrote the book called Sharon and My Mother-in-Law. Because I had two occupations, one outside the house, which Israeli with Sharon army, and my mother-in-law was inside the house. And that made a writer out of me. So ever since then, I had become a writer. In 2011, it was 30 years of being the director of Riwaq, and I decided to start the Arab Spring. Actually, I always say the Arab Spring started in Riwaq. Sorry, all the Arab countries did not manage. I decided to come down, pass on my dictatorship to younger generation. So in a ceremony in which I was given a prize, I decided that I'm going to pass on. I'm no more the director of Riwaq, and I hand it on to 2 younger people in the crowd. And when I went to meet them, I asked them one question, and they asked me one question. I asked them, Mabruk, you had become both the director of Riwaq, but I want you to think of one thing. Who is going to be the director after you? I didn't say Mabruk. I said, Min jay ba'altukum mudir. If you want to carry on with this institution called Riwaq, you have to think from today that you're not going to be the director more than 10 years. You have to think in 10 years of passing on to other people. And the other thing, they asked me, what would your legacy be? And I said, I would like this organization to have 75% women architects and not less than 7%. So that is the legacy of Riwaq, in which I will just describe very quickly to you. Riwaq is really an NGO in which we are trying to protect the cultural heritage in Palestine. And I could divide it into 3 phases. The first one was a documentary in which we did a survey of what do we have in Palestine? We did something called the Registry of Historic Buildings, in which every architect and student of architecture participated, and we came up with 50,000 buildings. We know information about 50,000 buildings. Second phase was creating a job creation through conservation. When you say conservation, preservation, you only think of the rich and the expensive buildings. Actually, we have made conservation as a job creation, a training course, and we have, as a center, created 130 cultural centers in villages in Palestine. And finally, and you're gonna get your chance to speak, finally, we have a project called the 50 Village Project. Our project is to protect, rehabilitate 50 historic centers in rural Palestine. And when we say rehabilitate, it means the whole historic center is being conserved under the the houses, cultural centers. We see in cultural heritage a tool for change, and I will come back to that again if I ever get a chance of this microphone again. Thank you.
Thank you, Suad. Wow, what a great story. I mean, you're preserving identities and cultures, and you're preserving our kind of who we are embedded in these buildings. But I want to ask Muhammad now. You're capturing our reality in your sculptures. I mean, or are you capturing our reality in our cultures? Like with your sculptures and these interiors and exteriors that you build in your home studio. I mean, what are you trying to tell us exactly?
Well, thank you, Amir. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. Where did the slides go? So I am the crazy Syrian architect, artist behind the miniature work you saw earlier. My training is not in art, my training is in architecture. I grew up outside Syria. I grew up in the Gulf region in a little compound for doctors with no roots whatsoever. I only lived in Syria 4 years. But that was the really fundamental years of teenage Muhammad to be there and to understand, walking in old Damascus, what architecture and archaeological sites can teach us about our roots and heritage. So when my peers were playing cards and smoking nargile, I was walking in old Damascus and just in awe of the Umayyad Mosque, and next to it Mary's Church, and this celebration of diversity and coexistence, and Melawiya happening on the other corner, and concerts and so on. And then I moved quickly to the United States, where I attained my architectural degree. The problem with that is, I'm a victim of a travel ban that was set in place in 2003, and I couldn't go back to home for about 10 years. So with distance comes perspective, and I learned about my culture and the archaeological sites and the architecture and the wealth of our country from afar. And with that came a guilt feeling, right? So fast forward 15 years later, when I started taking my art to the public and remodeling the destruction to raise awareness, and remodeling the old antiquity of these cities also to raise awareness, it became very evident to me that art has been حد يرد على التليفون. Art is this unique ability to educate. I, in the United States, find myself speaking to two different audiences, right? Yes, I am in my work documenting the status quo in the Middle East and the war and destruction, to sort of paint a picture for somebody in the West that has never stepped a foot in our region, to say, here's what people are running from. This is how devastating the current situation is. But on the complete other hand, I'm also painting a picture of how this land used to be. For our generations that have grown up not knowing for the last 10, 12 years anything about their roots, like me, other than war, destruction, and so I was lucky to go experience old Damascus and Aleppo in their golden ages. So I tried to recreate these cities in miniature form with embedding soundscapes that I recorded from Syria to sort of teach and a little bit educate our youth about that cultural wealth. So the importance of that is rebuilding the minds and the hearts to be able to have this affection to a country that hopefully you're planting a seed in somebody that might be interested in rebuilding down the road, or at least fighting for a cause, for civil rights, so on. What we're facing today is a huge second generation, as the professor mentioned, the second generation that is being raised in a host country, and they want nothing to do with their identity. It is, in fact, the third generation in the United States that are saying, who was my grandfather? Why is my last name Nahas? Is it real Hafiz? Who are we, And so that's what I see my art going through, an educational and awareness-raising stage right now.
Thank you indeed. I mean, Kinan, also you deal with this issue of taking home with us or crafting home. You amazed us and you set the bar so high 2 days ago with Home Within. So do you see yourself also in shaping our culture now, or in your performance and art performance? Where do you see yourself as a player in the cultural narrative?
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you. Just a little quick announcement. This man, he's a great moderator, but also he's a wonderful guitarist and a musician. We just had a jam session yesterday. I just wanted to mention it right from the get-go.
It was a secret.
Right. All right, let me backtrack a little bit. Some of you have seen the performance we had. How many of you actually were at the performance a couple days ago? Please forgive me if I'm repeating some of the thoughts I already shared with you. 2 days are too short to come up with new philosophies about art. Yes, what you said, Amr, is absolutely true. Home certainly is one of the anchors through which I create or try to create. But I don't think it's the only one. It's something that I shared with you also 2 days ago about, my vision of art, what art is, which has been something that I questioned for actually since I started playing the clarinet. To become a decent musician, you have to spend so many hours in a practice room. And to try to link it with education a little bit, some of the problems I had growing up is nobody asked me, why are you practicing the instrument? Like, what keeps you in a practice room for 7 or 8 hours a day? And nobody addresses the idea that you're trying to communicate using the tool. And home for me is one of these ideas that I would like to share with my art, but it's not limited to that. The performance you saw 2 days ago is certainly one that hits home the closest. But I equally feel comfortable doing things that have absolutely nothing to do with anything that we can use with language. I guess my theory is if I'm able to say with words what I'm trying to create with my art, there's no need for the art altogether. The art itself has to open gates for us. If we're here like 150 people, I'm hoping that people will get 150 different interpretations of an artwork. Carrying home, for me, home is so much linked to identity. Again, some people define home as where memories are. Some people they define home also again as, the most, from a very pragmatic perspective, that's the place where I immigrated to, and that's the place that offered me the best opportunities, which is equally valid. Mine has always been, it's the place I want to contribute to without having to justify it. And that, I think, and in that sense, the home that you're creating with your art / your identity has a very dynamic form. I don't think it's static in no time in our lives. Home can be a window, like a slice, a window in a slice of time that you look back at, or you look at it in a futuristic way, hoping that this is what home can become. I would like to share a little conversation I had with the wonderful cellist Yo-Yo Ma, who leads the Silk Road Ensemble, besides being an international soloist. We were talking about the idea of identity in art. And he asked me, Kinan, how do you define yourself? So I said, I'm a clarinetist and a composer, from Damascus, living in New York. He said, why don't we start from the beginning? I said, okay, when I was a little kid, I was the young clarinetist in Damascus. Few years go by, my identity changes. I become a clarinetist from Damascus. I'm no longer young. I started to travel around, the Arab world at least. I became from the clarinetist from Damascus, I became the Syrian clarinetist. Later on, I started to compose, so I became the Syrian musician. And I think the natural next step for me is to become the musician. You're not dropping identities. Actually, the opposite is true. I think you're accumulating more and more identities as you go forward. And what he said something that I really loved. He said, Kinan, I think there's still one step forward. I said, what is it? He said, you become a human eventually. That even what you do doesn't matter. It's actually what you do with that. And for me, again, it's always been these three fundamentals when it comes to art. There's an idea, there's the tool, and there's the skill. And the clearer that path is between the idea, the tool, using the skills, then home is only one aspect of what you're trying to communicate. But I think all of us, what we share is that art does offer us possibilities that are not available to us using language or in our daily lives. And that's why we love art.
Wow, what a powerful message. Thank you so much. Bishar, you are a different kind of performer. I mean, this character you have, you are using this cultural character of this ancient old Nabatean guy who's stuck in a basement or somehow, or what, this kind of place. And
Basement or apartment, yes. Okay.
Funny hat, and you're trying to spread knowledge through this cultural lens. Do you think there is potential for your initiative, or what is also driving you to do such initiative? Can you please tell us a little bit more about it?
First, I'm glad to be here among you. Thank you very much. In fact, it all started when my brother sent me the first script. It was talking about regime of historicity and attention economy. It was a research article, although it was written in Arabic, classical Arabic with the Syrian dialect. It was very hard, it was very heavy. I went down to my garage, the garage of my apartment. I dressed up, combed my hair, my beard, my mustache, and I started filming myself, saying the words. Then I watched what I did, and it was very disgusting for me. It was very formal. So I did this character. I read these words. We're talking about an dystopia, an Arabic, the situation in Syria and the Arab world generally. It's gray. I chose the colors. I chose the character, which expresses me. I'm from Damascus. I put the mosaic boxes in front of me. I didn't change the dialect I use to speak. This is the hat, my hat. The tea, of course, the Syrian tea. This is very important. Of course, this is in my garage. In fact, I have the tarbouche, the mosaic box, the Damascene uniform, na'na' in front of me, mint, and very stupid things. Yeah, that's it. The thing to massage the head. Everything I found in my apartment in France. I live in France. In fact, I was shooting in France. I put it in front of me to express myself. In fact, so I got his script. I tried to put anyone who is going to hear or listen or watch me in my place. In fact, we have maybe a problem in our region is people don't like when someone shows off in front of them. Okay, I'm well educated in France. If I tell them that I'm well educated in France and I speak to them with knowledge that comes from literature and the articles and the books, it would be hard for them to accept. I will be lecturing them. So I tried to be one of them because I'm one of them at the end of the day. So this is why I chose this character, and this is why I choose to speak intentionally in a Damascene Syrian dialect with words from classical Arabic. And this is how it started. I shoot the first episode 0, Sultan Zamanak. It's called Sultan Zamanak, the Sultan of your time. We're talking about attention economy, as I said, about the social media impact on our lives, as of course in Syria and the Arab world. And in 1 week, it gains 100,000 views. Until now, we have about 7 to 8 million views till now. You're watching a star in the Arab world now. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, so this is how it started, in fact. I was trying to talk to the viewer as a friend because, in fact, when I was in Turkey, we started shooting in France. Then we have a contract now with a television, with a TV channel. So when I was in Turkey, there's someone who works there. He was former detained in prison, and he barely writes or reads. And he came to me and he said to me, "I understand everything you say." And we talk very hard subjects. Talk political science, economy, philosophy, sociology, history. If you have the chance to look at the TV show, we really try. The subject is very hard, complicated, but we try to simplify it, to vulgarize it in French, as my brother said. So he said to me, I understand everything you say, and this is enough for me. I delivered my message. I receive messages from the father and the son saying to me that thank you, you've done something good for my son. My son now in Germany, which is the first country of viewership, in fact, in Germany, Syrian refugees. They say thank you. Maybe you help my son who's 18 or 19 to take another path in his life. So that's the main message. But to talk about the image, in fact, I have always been fascinated by the mixture of music, word, performance, visual. This mixture that makes that reaches people's heart. This is why I try to take care of every detail in the show. My gestures, my body language, my emphasis on words, the way I pronounce any word. And of course, I try to brand myself, brand the Damascene dialect, and brand the Damascene heritage, in fact. This is why, for example, when I speak French or English words, I try to speak them with a good accent to show people that we Syrians, we can learn, we can be well educated, and we can add or give to the world. So this is the message of the program, and I wish it's growing. It's getting very good. The last episode was Friday evening. Now it's 160,000 views. It's gaining more and more popular in the Arab region. So subscribe, please, likes and shares. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bishar. You know, I heard you have fans transcending the SJLP region. You have fans in Morocco, North Africa, and you have fans in Gaza. So you're reaching people everywhere. So I salute you for this. Thank you so much.
We've just received a comment or a message from an Egyptian, although the episode, the last one, was about industry in Damascus in the late 19th century and the 20th century. We've received messages from Egypt, Morocco, people who speak, or foreigners who speak Arabic. This is very good. Thanks God for His blessings and for the success and for people's support. And thank you very much, because I know there are some fans here. Thank you, fans.
Thank you. Well, we spoke about your passions, and we spoke about what you were missing and what you're feeling, but let's talk about your responsibility. Do you have responsibility when you're practicing your art, or you're doing your art, you're performing your art? What kind of responsibility falls on you? And I'm going to start with you, Mohammed, because you've said artists are the critics of society. Their work should depict both a society's glory and immortality. So what do you mean exactly, and where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as responsible when you're producing artwork?
Yes, absolutely. I do believe that artists are documenters of their times, especially those of us who have the privilege to witness everything from afar and live in the diaspora. That's a privilege. I'm here to sort of speak to tomorrow's leaders as well, all of you, my fellow SJLP. ما أنا بقول لك كمان هو صعبة يا أختي. أيوة أنا عارف صعبة. حبتين قبل الظهر وحبتين بعد الظهر. SJLP. طفالي الميكروفون. Democracy. Anyway, I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. I'm not gonna tell you I was Mr. Activist for the whole of my life. You know, I was trained as a corporate architect. I was going 500 miles an hour, designing skyscrapers around the United States. You stand in my way, would have trouble, right? I was affected by the Syrian war. I was emotionally, engaged. But there's always a perception inside all of us that crises are over there. I'm safe. My family is good. It didn't show up. So what changed my perspective on that responsibility of seeing one of my family members as a refugee in a refugee camp in Sweden. That stopped me in my tracks, a complete concrete barrier. He was a very successful architect, very comfortable life. Last time I saw him, I was so impressed with what he did in Syria that I was just this close to joining him and moving in 2011 back. So seeing him going from that comfortable situation to a refugee in middle of Sweden, meanwhile, I'm living in the United States, dealing with this rhetoric that refugees come from nowhere, nothing to give to host societies, nothing to contribute, they have no previous lives, they have nothing, you know. Painting with one broad brushstroke. As an American citizen, we have a leader today that is pulling travel bans that color Muslims, you know, and ban them from entering the United States just based on color and ethnicity and religion. I looked at myself, I said, Muhammad, wake up. There are thousands of architects that can do what you do. How many of them are Arab, Syrian, immigrants, Muslims, brothers to refugees, grown up in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, raised in Syria, but educated in the Midwest of the United States, can speak the language of both East and West, can connect people from East and West and build cultural bridges during xenophobic divided times? The answer was, there's a handful of people in the West that can do that. They're in this room. That's why I'm here. That's the handful of people that can do so. Automatically, it puts a responsibility on our shoulders to humanize, not romanticize, humanize. By sharing our stories, by sharing our narratives. Some of the suitcases tell stories of refugee families that have been resettled in the United States. How do you use your platform in the West, your access, right, to put a story of a Syrian or Iraqi or Afghani refugee out there when they might not have the access, right? What is your responsibility? How do you humanize? How do you build a common denominator? How do you reach out to somebody with extremely spicy opinions against refugees, Muslims, Arabs, albeit whatever, and say, hold on a second. You've known me as Maurizio, the Italian architect, but let me tell you something about my other parallel identity. I also happen to be XYZ, right? And this is our life, and this is how it existed. And I'm not an anomaly. I'm just a middle person, normal Joe, middle-class guy from Syria. A lot of people in the region will relate very much to my experience. We are not disposable, Sheikh. We are not disposable. And we come from culture, and we come from heritage, and we come from substance. And I did not park my camel outside, right? But you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised. I give talks at highly accredited, very high profile, and you'll be surprised the amount of we're fighting such a huge narrative against us. You know, I show them a photo of a church next to a mosque in Damascus, and people go, hold on, Mohammed, you guys got churches in Damascus? Yes. You live side by side? Yes. Right? So I could not say that in my architectural firm, right? But my art opened the doors for me to have these thorny, touchy conversations with a little bit of humor. And at the end of the day, you know, people meet Kenan, people meet Amir, people meet, you know, Muhammad, and all of you, tomorrow's leaders, right? And they will walk away knowing that, okay, I know that is an artist from the region, and here's my experience with them. The next time a politician is gonna come, talk that rhetoric, and try to pull another travel ban, your allies, your friends that you've gained in your professional life will stand up first and say, shut your face, that's not the Muslims and Arabs I've been used to. So, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit blunt. Thank you.
Well, thank you indeed, Mohammed. Kenan, you said during your concert the other day, performing art for the sake of pleasure. How do you deal with this when you are a representation of a culture, when you're going abroad and you're the identity, like you're embodied in this culture? So how would you say there is maybe a bit of responsibility, or there is not responsibility, or why art for the sake of pleasure only?
I love what happens when a sentence is taken out of context. When I mentioned pleasure in the Q&A, I do believe actually if you also go back and put a wider perspective, art is an act of freedom. And that freedom should apply in every possible way, including breaking free from what people expect you to do. You know, sometimes, yes, we are dealing collectively, you know, Syrian tragedy is a human tragedy, and all of us are dealing with it in different ways. But we're not dealing with it all the time. I think we owe it to ourselves to find little pleasures in life. Life is very precious, and we have to really do things we like to do, too. And in my profession, which is incredibly abstract, I can maneuver between what is abstract and what is actually inspired by home. But also, talking about home to you gives me pleasure. I don't think one cancels the other, you know? The responsibility of the artist, when it comes to the responsibility in general, I think it's not only on the artist. I think all of us share the responsibility for art and culture. Actually, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but I find it very interesting that the discussion on culture was the last session in this forum. You know, and it will be, I hope that it doesn't reflect our priorities. Personally, I do think that art making, and culture is maybe the most important thing that humanity has ever produced. And yes, immortality can be great, but I think it can be miserable without art and culture. So the responsible artist, I don't think you can separate the artist from the citizen. It's about how you communicate with your surrounding. But most importantly, to be able to communicate with your surrounding, you have to be very honest with your own feelings. Because only when you put that out, you will see it. Art mirrors not only society, but also it gives you a great perspective of who you are and what you do. You know, when you come to the actual performance, when you play, you can easily think that, you know, I'm doing my responsibilities, I'm talking about Syria, and I hope that this opens windows for people to investigate more. But I do feel the responsibility is clearer when you work with students. There's one of these photos that come up, and it doesn't really cost anything to do that. I think all of us, artists and individuals, are able to contribute to bring culture to people who don't have access to that. This is a photo that happened in Jordan, actually. I smuggled about, I don't know, 200 recorder flutes. They are so cheap, $2 a piece or something. And my idea was, this is back in 2014, is to flood you know, a refugee camp with musical instruments. How long can that stay? I don't know. Also, how sustainable it can be, also I don't know. But I do know that working with students, where artists remove themselves from what they are trying to say and focus on what somebody younger is trying to say. And I think then when the responsibility becomes clear.
Thank you very much, Kinan. Christian, I'm gonna have a tough question. As a historian, have you, and studying and focusing on our region, have you seen any incidents or observations where art drove change, or when art played a role in changing narratives in our region?
That's a tough question. I see it slightly differently. I mean, I see art as a reflection of a culture's values. As a historian, I'm interested in all kinds of evidence. You know, poetry is evidence. Art is evidence. Architecture is evidence. Texts are evidence. And for me, I think very much as you said, you know, the artists are the documentarians of a time. And so we could speak about any number of periods of history, and we could see the momentous changes that are sweeping through society manifest themselves in visual form, in the form of architecture. Not to focus on what I know best, but maybe a good example of this, which is very much a story set in Bilad al-Sham, is all about the rise of Islam and the ways in which it manifests itself in the visual record. And my students know I love coins. Coins are a great window into the ways in which a state, a society, a religion represents itself to its subjects. And in the 7th century, when Islam was something new, was finding its way, was very much in the process of shaping the culture, this new ascendant culture, very much Assyrian culture at the beginning of this history, was mixing and mingling symbols and motifs that had existed in Syria long before, but synthesizing them and melding them with the language of the new. So to track the history of Islam in Syria in the 7th century is very much to study the ways in which that culture looks back in time, borrows the language of the Byzantines, of the Christians, of the Greeks, the Jews, all these people had been there before, but sort of remakes it anew. And I think it's one way in which art can kind of seduce us into a world, help us see it much more clearly, far more clearly than words. And this is what I constantly tell my students, you know, if a text is difficult to look at, go and inspect a piece of art, and it will speak much more vividly and much more clearly to a transition. And I think that that's what's beautiful about the art that all of you are producing, which speaks to another moment of transition, another moment of difficulty in which, say, the culture of Syria, the culture of Bilad al-Sham is refashioning itself. When people look back and they think, where was this coming from? Where was it going? I think it's going to be the paintings, it's going to be the music, it's going to be the architecture, it's going to be the poetry that will help us see that much more clearly than newspaper articles, records of what happened where, which politician made the decision.